Hi there, I'm Dan Bevan. I hope that music woke everybody up. Let's see, there seems to be some disconnect about titles here. This is my third trip to the Skeptics track, and I hope I have absorbed some skeptic philosophy. So this time I'm going to talk skeptically about being transgender, and in particular 3 issues that are at the political cutting edge right now. I should say that transgender people don't agree on a lot of things, and I don't agree with a lot of transgender people on things. I like to say that the only thing we have in common is about 25 genes, and we disagree about that too. So, as you'll see. So I'm a biopsychologist, which means I try to make sense out of how the brain works and to make behavior. And I went to those schools. I'm not trying to impress you with where I went. They're there because at the time they were all male, and I was very deeply transgender at the time, which made it very interesting. So I've written 4 books on transgender science, and I'll show you what some of those are a little bit later. But I recently got my name changed. Actually, when I was here, I was Thomas Bevan the last 2 times, and now through the courtesy of Chris Christie having left office, I've now changed my name to Dana Bevan. That's a long story. Yeah, okay. But yeah, you did. That's very nice of you. So I have a podcast, and I'm soon going to have a video blogcast on YouTube, and I blog monthly at Transgender Forum. I'll give you the information on that in a bit. Okay, so I'm going to look at 3 issues that are out there, and skeptics like to deal with claims. So we're going to talk about some of the claims, both the ones that transgender people have and the ones that other people have, and what I think. So, and I'm right, but you knew that, right?
You have the microphone.
Yes, I have the microphone. So the first has to do with are sex and gender the same thing, or the independent variables? That's a big issue for transgender people because, as we'll see, some people are trying to redefine sex and gender. Then the next one has to do with nature versus nurture. For about 200 years, we fought the nature versus nurture battle, and now there seems to be another way of looking at it that seems to make more sense. And then the next one is, can you really change sex? I guess is the subtitle, and there are people on both sides of that, and I'll try to talk to you about what the facts are, and you can make your own mind. Okay, so the first is, are sex and gender the same thing? And there was legislation introduced in Kentucky a couple years ago to make it so that sex and gender were the same thing. And the Trump administration's now playing with a rule, which means that transgender people won't exist in some sense. But we need to get back to what that argument's all about and what's gone on there. First of all, gender wasn't used in this context until the 1960s. And this guy, John Money, who you see down below there, his problem was he had kids with indeterminate sexual organs, and he had to tell his parents how to raise those kids. And there's an example of a person who, Brenda, who's there, that's a best-selling book by John Colapinto, who had an accident shortly after birth and he had a twin who was a identical twin who became a male, and they tried to raise Brenda as a girl, and things did not work out. But at any rate, John Money had the problem of how do you tell parents how to raise your kid? And back in that era, they would do surgeries on kids as soon as they came out to try to make them normal. And but still, there was this problem of how do you raise those kids? So he invented the idea of gender. He stole it from language declensions, and to define the gender behavior category that the parents should raise these kids with the expectation that that would be a successful thing. So that's how it got started. But pretty soon, some social scientists, parenthetically, who should have known better, and journalists started conflating sex and gender, that gender became a polite word for sex, because if you're doing social science, you don't like to ask questionnaires. You don't want to put sex on the questionnaire because it's inappropriate, it's non-PC. So now we're in a situation where sex and gender are conflated all the time by everybody on TV, and they really should be kept to mean the same thing as when they started. And then there's some that say that they are correlated, and some that say they're not correlated. Here we go. So there's a claim that sex and gender behavior category are independent from one another. A lot of transgender people believe this, and it's half true. And in 1965, this guy, John Olivan, who was a psychiatrist, started using the word transgender as a replacement for transsexual, because by then they have realized that transgender people aren't really concerned so much with their sex as with their gender, that they change their sex, if you will, to try to bring it conformance with the gender that they believe they are. So that's how transgender got its name and got its start. But then there are other people who claim that gender behavior doesn't exist at all. It's just all sex-type behavior. And those are the people who are also associated with religious orientation and and in particular, there are two here. One is Ryan Anderson, who wrote a book called When Harry Became Sally. I wrote a blog post about that in which I concluded that Harry couldn't become Sally because he already was Sally. So, I don't care for that type of anti-science kind of thing. And then there's Deborah Soh, whom may have seen on Joe Rogan's show and some other things on the intellectual dark web, saying that, oh yeah, sex and gender are different, but there's so few transgender people that it really doesn't matter. So we'll examine that in a little bit. So it's true that both sex and gender are correlated. That is, if you look at people, non-transgender people as well as transgender people, there's a correlation, which we all know about, that males are typically in the masculine gender and females are in the feminine gender. And those are the, in the confusion matrix, those are the cardinal cells, but there are also cells with transgender people in them. And so there's a definite correlation, but I'll go into why I think they're independent variables. They just happen to be correlated. Some transgender people don't fit into either of those patterns these days. Some are declare their own gender or to be gender queer or gender fluid, or it goes on and on, different kinds of labels. So one of the problems here is that we have research that's going on that has occurred, and the social sciences in particular and other people are writing them up, and they're using the word gender, and we don't know whether that is whether they really meant gender, whether they really meant, or did they really mean sex. So there's actually a AAAS, American Association for Advancement of Science, editorial that says, hey, we got to do something about this, and you really got to define what you mean in all your papers. So it's an interesting issue. Okay, so are sex and gender independent? Well, there are two lines of evidence. The first one is the existence of transgender people, and they exist. You can't deny that they do exist, although some people think they're deluded and pathological, but they do exist. And they behave in a gender category that's not the one they were assigned at birth. And in our culture, it may be obvious, but I'll say it anyway, is that if you're born male, you are assigned to the masculine gender behavior category, and if you're born female, to the feminine one. But transgender people don't adhere to those rules that culture has established. So there's another line of evidence, which about a year ago I had a blinding flash of the obvious. And that is, if I was looking at twin studies of transgender people, and there's an interesting dissociation. To make a long story short, and I'll come back to genetics in a little bit, but if an identical twin, that is one that starts out with the same DNA as his twin pair, the other person in this twin pair, if one of them is transgender, then the other is transgender about half the time, which supports the idea that genetics is involved. But what about that other 50% of the time? Okay, there are identical twins, one of which is transgender, the other is not, but they both have the same sex. So there's a dissociation there between sex and gender that's biological and can't be denied. And down at the bottom, you see a couple of transgender twins on the left and on the right, where they're both transgender, and on the left, and on the right you see a pair of identical twins where one has transitioned to the feminine or female sex. So the other question is, I should explain who Deborah So is. Deborah So she gave up her career as a neuroscientist and started writing for Playboy and a few other publications. Not that there's anything wrong with Playboy, you understand. But, and she went to school in Toronto, where she was influenced by a lot of people a lot of scientists there, psychiatrists really, who had particular ideas about transgender people, i.e. that they were pathological, but they could be retrained. I'll come back to that in a little bit. But so she's been trying to foster this idea that and she misquotes the studies that, that says that number of the population frequency of being transgender is 0.3%. Well, that's an old number. That's about 3 years old. The correct number is from about 2000, is that transgender people will number at least 1% of the population and probably more. And we get that from that lady who's in the picture there. That's Conway, and she did the study to show that. She actually went out and beat the bushes and counted noses of transgender people. Lynn Conway. She's also important because she invented the modern computer. When she was, but she never really got credit for it until now. Any rate, so there have been a lot of studies from UCLA, the Williams Institute there, and what they're trying to do is calculate the population frequency of transgender people, and from a CDC survey. Well, the CDC survey wasn't designed to do that. And what they're doing is certain states did the CDC survey, did include a question on being transgender. But what they did was and what they are still doing is taking those states and using their demographics to project what the whole population frequency is and how many are in other states based on demographics. So it's it's not the best data, but they've grown. The number has gone from 0.3% to now it's around 0.7% of the population they reckon are transgender. There are a lot of problems with that study, and we're still not able to count transgender people because the administration won't let us. It was supposed to be in the census. And we can't even count senior transgender people, which were supposed to be counted in a senior survey, because that was taken out. So more recent studies in schools, these are kids, these are early teenage kids, show that now the percentages they found were 1.3% and now 2.7% of kids say they're transgender. And there are other results, mainly in Europe, that actually indicate that there might be upwards of 6% of the population. But those ask different questions and they have different forms of evidence. So 2.7%, by the way, is more than the population of the city of New York and all other cities in the United States. It's a large number, and her contention that we should ignore those people is not tenable in my estimation. Oh, I know, by the way, all those transgender kids have mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and people that care about them, and so the allies are considerably more than that. So it looks like sex and gender are independent of each other, although they're correlated. You can't argue with the cardinal values of, that they're correlated. But they seem to be independent. Being transgender is not rare. It's misleading to conflate sex and gender for any purpose, but certainly for political purposes. And one of the reasons we needed to clear this up, in addition to, at least scientifically, is to try to make sense out of current results. So next issue I want to talk about is nature versus nurture. Which started, I guess, with the Greeks and trying to figure out what, in this particular case, which affects behavior. And I won't give away the punchline. I'll give away the punchline. They both do. So, but there are people who claim that transgender people are born this way. You've heard that song, and in fact, there's actually a Born This Way Foundation, as I understand it. That it's the biological nature of certain people to be transgender at birth. And then on the other hand, there are people who, mostly the feminists, radical feminists, that claim that gender is culturally constructed, learned and practiced. And that's a problem because it's a basis for reparative therapy change efforts, that is, where transgender kids are taken into facilities and they try to retrain them to be in the appropriate gender, for at least the way culture sees it. So their contention is that trans kids, in particular, are just confused and or unable to learn about gender, and so they make mistakes. And there's a fellow right there, that's Ken Zucker, who was recently fired from the University of Toronto, or from the Canadian Addiction and Mental Health Gender Clinic in Toronto. And that was a big issue. He was doing reparative therapy, and we know better than to do that right now. Oh, by the what's wrong? Well, I'll get to it. So, nature and nurture for several centuries it was hotly debated. But now we've come around to think about it as being multiple factors that are involved. Things like genetics, the science, which is DNA coding, epigenetics, which is non-DNA chemical events that affect DNA directly by mutating it, or affect how it's expressed to tell the cell what to do. There's, of course, the prenatal environment, which we don't have a lot of good information on, except for chemicals that cause horrible mutations. Thalidomide and diethylstilbestrol are two of them, but we know that they occur. The postnatal environment, we really don't know much about. At 1 year of age, boys, all male children, how's that, all have a big surge of testosterone. And we don't know why that is, and we think it has something to do with bone density starting up, but we really don't know. And then the same males in puberty get a big shot of estrogen. We think that's to shut down bone growth there as well, but whether it has behavioral effects, we don't know. And I'll talk a little bit more about early learning. Basically, you can't be transgender unless you know something about gender, and kids learn it. And they do experimentation with gender behavior. You know, they get rewards and punishments by culture and by their family, by their clergy. So that must have an effect on behavior. And then that leads into teenage and adults who originally were transgender kids, but they drop out. And we see them dropping out of studies all the time. Doing these longitudinal studies, as you can imagine, is fraught with a lot of problems. Not the least of which is if you were assessed at 10 years old of being a transgender kid, and now you're trying to live in secret, as I did, at the age of 21, I'm not going to fess up to that. So there's and I don't even want anything to do with a gender clinic that I was in when I was 10. So we don't really have a good handle on that. That's a whole nother issue of contention. And then recently there's been, I know this is a skeptics group, but if you know what Lamarckian inheritance of acquired characteristics was and is, which essentially says that what you learn and what you experience gets carried on to your children and grandchildren. It turns out there's some examples of that. The Netherlands famine during World War II, for one thing, and those things have effects on behavior. So there may be some merit in looking at that as well. So there are four main factors that look pretty good in terms of being involved with being transgender. The first is genetics. Last year there was an article published by, you don't have to take my word for it, by 20 world-class geneticists, and I'm sure they would tell you that they were world-class, saying that what fit transgender people was something called a polygenetic threshold model, meaning that there were about 25 genes that were involved, and when they all pointed to in the same direction, or where a certain majority of them pointed to the same direction, then the person would be transgender. So polygenetic just means multiple genes, and the threshold means that if there are enough of them, you become transgender. So we know, as I said earlier, if identical twins, heritability, it runs from 0.35 to 0.65, and I just picked 50% as kind of in the middle of those studies. This also kind of explains why being transgender seems to run in families. I taught, year before last, I taught in Pride School, Atlanta, and I had a dozen trans kids. I taught 7th grade science, so these were all teeny boppers, I guess they're going, they've started puberty and so on. And so I would just sit there and listen to them while I was eating my lunch, and they would, one of them would say, well, my father's trans, and the other one would say, well, my grandfather's trans. And the same sort of, and it reminded me the same sort of discussion that would go on in support groups back in the 80s when I was on the way to coming out. That a lot of people knew of people in their family who were trans, but at that point in time, you couldn't do a family tree because the parents and grandparents hadn't come out. We're starting to get some evidence about that. Well, in particular, here are the, you all saw The Matrix, right? In the Matrix series, and V for Vendetta and Downhill Racer. Don't go see Downhill Racer. So that was produced and directed and written by the Wachowski brothers, who are now the Wachowski sisters, Lana and Lily there. And they're both still making movies, but they both have transitioned. And that's just a high-profile example. There are lots of examples. So what it looks like is that not gender, but gender, what we would call a predisposition is biological, comes from the genetics. And, we all know about predisposition by 23andMe and all those other things, predispositions for diseases and problems and good things too, I suppose. And of course the classic one is the BRCA gene, which is responsible in some cases for breast cancer. But even if you have this particular gene, you may not get breast cancer. It's just a predisposition to that. So there are all kinds of predispositions, and it looks like genetic gender behavior predisposition exists. So let's see, talked about that. So there are non-DNA epigenetic chemical mechanisms. It turns out that some of these occur at conception, where the father or mother provides a deciding factor chemically, which is not part of the DNA. Some of them actually occur before that. And of course, the ones that most people are interested in are the ones that occur during gestation, during when the mother's carrying the fetus. But we don't really know, we have a lot of ideas about that. We have a thing called the genome now, right? We know we can tell all about somebody's DNA. So what we need now is an epigenome, and that's in the works in the next few years. So as I said before, half the time if the identical twin is transgender, his mate will not be. Well, here's some identical twins down at the bottom here on the left. Those girls pretty much look like each other, but there's still some differences, right? One's got a broader nose than the other, and so on. But on the right, those are identical twins. They were conceived with the same DNA, and by the time they were born, they looked quite differently. So I started talking to my daughter about this, and she catches babies for a living. She probably wouldn't like me to say that, but she's an OB/GYN, and she delivers a lot of babies, some of which are twins. And I said, well, what gives? And she says, oh yeah, it happens all the time. There are always differences between the two twins, even though they're identical. And that's a well-established kind of thing, which was kind of new to me. I didn't realize that radical change could occur. So we need to know more about that. If there are blocking mechanisms that prevent the expression of genes for being transgender, then we need to know what those are. So the other two factors are, first of all, culture. We live in a rather unique culture in terms of gender. It's binary. There are only two genders. It's cisgender in that, as I said before, if you're male, you're assigned automatically to the masculine gender, and vice versa with female children. And it's also inflexible, which makes transgender people outlaws like me. So we're in violation of cultural rules of behavior. But other cultures don't have that. They're quite different. Some cultures have up to 5 gender categories. Some have 4. A lot have 3. And American Indians, for example, had both 3 and 4 gender behavior categories. And of course, they were obliterated by Europeans, to put it succinctly. And the same thing's true in the South Pacific. There are 3 and 4 gender people in groups that lived in Polynesia, but the nuclear bomb tests moved them to Hawaii. So we disrupted a lot of these indigenous cultures. And some of them use childhood behavior tests that will observe the child and see what he's interested in, he or she, what they're interested in. Oh yeah, in my study of this, I find that most of these cultures don't have pronouns, so there's not a problem there. But and some of them even do ritual testing of, they'll put them in a circle and start a fire around the circle and see which tools they pick up to get out of the circle. The idea being is that those are linked to the gender category they should be in. So down here on the left, you see a person named Weewa. And Weewa, you can see Weewa wore the garb of a feminine gender in the Zuni culture. And this is a peach blossom necklace, by the way. And I got it because my mother went down to Arizona and bought it from a Zuni. So this person back in the 1880s got to be pretty famous. A writer got a hold of the story of this person, and the Weewa made some pretty good blankets and pottery and art objects, and so she wrote a lot of articles back then. And so it came time that Weewa went to Washington, D.C., and to put some of Weewa's art into the Smithsonian. And while Weewa was there, he met with Grover Cleveland, and everything was fine. And so he got back to. I just gave it away. Weewa went back to Arizona, and the writer suddenly discovered that Weewa was born a male and was a third gender Lamana in the Zuni tribe. And third gender people there engage in those kinds of arts. But they also are strategists for war. In fact, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were both third gender people. Anyway, so in the middle you see, you all know who Ann Dunham was, right? Who knows who Ann Dunham was? Nobody knows who Ann Dunham was. Okay, well, Ann Dunham was working on her master's degree and went to Indonesia. And while she was there, she had a child with her, and she needed a nanny for the child because she was busy collecting data. Well, Ann Dunham is the mother of Barack Obama, and Barack Obama had a third gender nanny, whom you see here, named Evie. And I don't think there are any pictures of her in her third gender outfits, but it's interesting that Obama was brought, you can see him there. He was a young lad, but he had a nanny who was in the third gender category. Evie is what they call a waria, W-A-R-I-A, third gender category. Also in Indonesia are the Bugis, who have 5 gender categories. And there's more to say about that. In particular, the Bugis have the 5th gender category is a inspirational leader, I guess is what you'd call it, someone who counsels people about life and troubles and so on. The problem with that is that the Bugis are Muslims, and that's typically in other places of the world, that's the job of the Muslim clerics. So there literally is a treaty, there's a fatwa in Indonesia, or whatever they call it, that delineates what this 5th gender person can do versus what the Muslim clerics will do. An example of how religion can adapt to other gender systems. Okay, and as I said before, children learn the fundamentals of gender by age 2 or 3, and some of them become transgender after learning that. That realization starts at 4 or 5 years old, For me, it was 4 3/4. I'll tell you why sometime about why I know that. So we are now treating transgender children, which is a whole nother controversial issue that I don't have time for, but maybe next time I'll go into. But the studies show that trans kids, they're not confused, as some people would have you believe, about gender. They know what, in fact, they know more than their non-trans kids do, because they have to learn 2 genders, and they know the differences between them. So the studies definitely show that they're not confused, because it becomes important to them when they realize that they're outlaws. What's going on here, in my opinion, is, remember we talked about predisposition, and for gender, is that kids start getting exposed to gender behaviors at an early age, and you can see some examples there. And they learn by being exposed to these gender characteristics. They learn what fits them best. That's the only way I can describe it. It's not a conscious decision. They just know it, as I did. And from the genetic gender behavior predisposition. Now you can say they were born that way, but there's a lot of other stuff going on here that might have made them not transgender. So as you can see on the right-hand side, those kids, there's no reason why the boys have to be dressed the way they are and the girls have to be dressed the way they are. Those are all learning about gender in our culture. And there's nothing magical about the colors pink and blue. In fact, before World War I, the colors were reversed. There was a famous song called Alice Blue Gown, which was the epitome of feminine behavior. And they thought that pink was too rough a color, too outstanding a color for female children. So there's no reason why pink and blue are color-coded to the behavior categories. At least no physical reason. There's the culture which has made them that. And actually before World War II or World War I, the trend was actually away from colors to all the kids wearing white. And the reason for that was if they are in white, they're interchangeable. If you have a female child, she can wear the same the same clothes as a previous male child. Very practical back then. But the advertisers got a hold of it and made it a big deal to try to make money. This is true. So the conclusion is, although we don't know all the factors involving transgender causation, and we haven't addressed a lot of them, it appears that there's a mixture of biological and non-biological factors involved. Of course, I should exert biopsychology privilege and say learning may be considered as being non-biological, but it's really biological in the sense that your capability of learning is biological. Okay, so last thing I'm going to talk about is it really possible to change sex? And you see this all the time about people who particularly are anti-trans say you can't do that, and we'll see about that. So they say it's immutable and determined exclusively by genetics. Chromosomes and genes are typically cited. That's one side. The other side is sex can be changed by hormones, surgery, and training. Representative there on the left are the sex change people, led by a guy named Lawrence Mayer, or Paul McHugh, who killed the transgender transition program at Johns Hopkins, but is widely cited and is frequently gets involved with lawsuits. And on the other side is the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, and they have the rules. They set the rules for how to transition from one sex to another. So they believe it's true. I have to admit that I'm a member of the board of directors of the U.S. version of WPATH. But I don't agree with most of the people on the board about things. So anyway, so if you look skeptically, you see that sex is almost always assigned at birth by a doctor who tips the kid upside down sometimes and slaps them on the behind and looks between their legs and says, aha, we have a male, or we have a female, or we have a, I'm not sure. So that's how we assign sex in this culture. And from that, you're expected to have a certain, behave in a certain gender behavior category. This assumes that that initial look at external genitalia means that the kid will be able to have children, that they have a viable reproduction system, which we know is not always true. But that's where our assumptions are. And almost never are kids tested for chromosomes or genes. I mean, it's just not done unless there's something peculiar. In fact, for transgender people, it's hardly ever done either. And it's beyond it's really beyond the state of the art to forecast what kind of genitalia or sex organs you're going to get by looking at chromosomes and the genome. We can go backwards and kind of say, well, yeah, XY is kind of associated with XY chromosomes are kind of associated with male, but going in the other direction, we can't really do a very good job of prediction because there's so much variability. You know, that kid who had great external genitalia may be infertile, or you know, may have two sets of internal genitalia, which does happen. So, and the other point to be made is if a man has prostate cancer and gets has an operation that changes his sex organs, or if a female has a hysterectomy, we still consider those people to have the same sex. That's not a thing that we do in our culture. So there's some wiggle room there on the side of, well, what does the culture say about people that don't have all the sex organs or functioning sex organs that a male or a female has to have? So how does transgender transition change sex? Briefly, there are a whole bunch of procedures that could happen, but mostly what happens is they start what's called hormone therapy. They take hormones for the opposite sex. You know, I took estradiol, green little pills, for the last 12 years. So they take hormones that change what the tissues see, but the tissues have both estrogen and testosterone receptors on them. And if the tissue starts to see more estradiol and less testosterone, then they're going to instruct the cells to change, and that's what happens for trans women that get bigger breasts, for example. But same thing's also true, that if you start taking testosterone, that male characteristics will start showing up. So that's one way that sex organs are changed. The other way, of course, which is what gets all the big press, is by surgery. We do a pretty good job of that for trans women. A not so good job for trans men, but we're working on that. In particular, medical science is forging right ahead. For example, it's now possible to do penile transplants. Now, guess who is sponsoring penile transplants? The Department of Defense is. And the reason is because there were lots of servicemen, at least 100, who were sitting in their Humvees, and they had an IED explode underneath them, and they had damage to that part of the body. So they are trying to learn from the South Africans and who have perfected the technique, and there have been several operations, mostly at Johns Hopkins, to do now those are from two males who have already had the right plumbing and so on. But with a little sophistication, we might get to transgender males, trans men getting that type of operation. And there have already been uterus transplants. In fact, I think at least 3 kids have been born with uterine transplants. And again, there's no reason why that couldn't happen in trans women. Actually, but it hasn't so far. Mostly it's been between mothers and their children, their daughters, when something happens that the daughter is infertile. So that's part of the analysis, that this is what happens in transition. So the finale here is, how many organs have to change? How many sex organs have to change in order for you to change sex? And we can already change the basic ones, breasts and genitalia, and even the brain changes. So with hormones, and we can do, for other kinds of things, we can do surgeries. So how many changes do you want to consider that person to have changed sex? And as I said, there's wiggle room on the other side, because there are people who have lost organs, and we don't claim that they've changed sex. They are still in the ball game there. So my conclusion is it's pretty clear that you can change sex, given our current knowledge and definitions. Now, you feel free to change how you define some of those things, but this thing is actually, you've heard of Zeno's paradox. This is a paradox called Sorites, or the heap paradox. That is, how many particles do you have to add to the mix there to call it a heap? It's one of the more obscure paradoxes from Greek history, but it's still there. So that's the story there. So in conclusion, sex and gender look like they're independent variables, or they're correlated. No one's disputing that. But it's misleading to conflate sex and gender. The people that say that they are the same thing are incorrect. Nature versus nurture is too simplistic. I showed you a list of factors that could be involved with being transgender, only 4 of which are pretty well established. And there are probably others that I don't know about, because we'll learn more about that in the future. And then finally, I believe that sex can be changed, given our current definitions of what sex is, and our knowledge of medical science as it advances to make that possible. So let's see. I don't make any money off of these, but these are this is self-promotion here. But I have I'll give you my email address, and I have a podcast and a vlog called The Transgender Scientist, and I do blog monthly at TG Forum, and that's I didn't make that up, my editor made that up. So even more a self-promotion, I've published 4 books. The left one is an autobiography wherein I am at 4 3/4 years old. How do I know that? Because it's Christmas time, and I was born in March. So, and the balloon says Merry Christmas, and it's a pink balloon. So that's me. The second one was one I wrote to capture all the information I could find on science of what was called transsexualism then, and transgenderism. Transsexualism is a dirty word now, so I have to change that. But that has like 800 references, scientific references to some of the issues we've just talked about. Being Transgender is a book for transgender people about how to, if you think you're transgender, start here and work through the book to try to help you. And then finally, the one I just published for doctors and primarily for doctors and psychologists is Transgender Health and Medicine, and that's the one that I have recently had a couple of book signings. But it was written for providers, but it also provides a lot of science and history, and for transgender people, it would help. I say that it would help hold their providers' feet to the fire of what they should be doing to help transgender people. So take your questions. We have some time. There you go.
I have a question. Sure. I've read a couple things about secondary sex characteristics, like face shape and muscle mass and things like that being affected by birth order of children. Like if the first child's a male, females later may have, more of those characters. Have you read anything or
right.
seen that with transgender being affected by the birth order?
The literature is that those kinds of birth order effects do appear. However, it doesn't appear that transgender people are involved. A lot of the early studies were a mixture of transgender gay people, and if you do the appropriate control groups, you find that birth order effect doesn't apply to being transgender. It does, however, seem to apply to homosexual people, at least the males. So I think I answered your question. I don't know about facial characteristics. All I know is about behavior, both transgender and homosexual behavior. Yes, sir.
Dr. Bevan, you were discussing some of the questionnaires that were used in some of the studies. Mm-hmm. And I guess my question more is, when you were discussing such as sex versus gender, you mentioned the fact that we use the term gender because we don't want to use the word sex. The questions that are being asked, are they, I guess the best way to put it is, are they asking the right questions? Because here's the thing, if I'm afraid to say I'm transgendered, mm-hmm. or I don't know, mm-hmm. then to ask me questions in regards to that would be more like trying right. to push me in that direction, as opposed to saying, right. where you take the example of the Indians, right. where they just put some items in the center and say, now you have to get out of the center, and they just allow them to pick. It's the same mm-hmm. thing. The question should just be, do they use questions right. that are very open, right. that allows you to see how a person is, instead of trying to put the box here. Okay,
Right.
are you in this box or that box?
Right. That has been studied extensively, and for providers. In fact, there's a section in my book on this. Under transgender etiquette, what's recommended now is at least a two-stage process where you ask a person what was their sex at birth, and then leaving room for not just male and female, but also other options. Like there are people called intersex people who were born with indeterminate external genitalia. So the recommended procedure is to ask about sex first, and then ask about gender, so that they're separate from each other, and you can fill in however you want in those questions, but always giving them a blank to fill in. And that's the recommended way of going about business, particularly if your clientele includes transgender people, but also if it's good for anybody. So yes, that has been studied in gory detail, I should say. There are probably 5 publications about it, but yeah, you're exactly right. You need to separate those two, and then the provider needs to figure out whether they're transgender or not. Yes, sir. Or
Yeah, you got it.
I got it right?
Hi there. Though, kind of speaking of which, is there any research about folks who identify as non-binary or gender fluid about any of this?
Right. There is a lot of research about it. There's not, none of which pleases me. Okay? The reason is because there are no good definitions of what those people are, behavioral definitions. Okay? And my solution to it is to make a behavioral inventory and see where see which boxes are ticked in terms of behaviors, because it's a middle ground, and some of the behaviors will be say masculine, some will be feminine, and some will be neutral. So first we need a good definition of what those terms mean. Right now those terms are primarily self-initiated, and the medical and other communities haven't really given it, I mean, they mentioned it in publications, but there's no depth there. Did I answer your question? Yeah.
I have more of a comment instead of a question directly. I was thinking, just looking at linguistics my whole life and being trans and discovering at about the same age that you did, that the language that we use when we're talking about sexuality and sexual preference are oftentimes also confused. Mm-hmm. And we only have 3 words to describe those: gay, straight, and bi. But if you're in the community of sexual science and studies, I think it's up to 17 different subcategories now. I don't mean any offense to them. I don't study them and try and memorize them.
Right.
But I have obviously respect for each one of them. I can see the real difficulty with the science and trying to segregate those. But I think that's been one of the biggest problems that we've had, is that people are associating the transgender with your sex, and as opposed to your sexual attraction.
Right.
And excuse the bluntness, but I had a therapist that put this in such clear terms.
Right.
He said, if you want to fuck a giraffe, you want to fuck a giraffe. That has nothing to do if you have a female brain.
Right.
And it was like, and it became very clear with that little sentence that the therapist came up with. But I just think the language that we have is just inadequate. And so we're talking about sex versus gender. We almost have to say, okay, well, there's genetic sex, there's mental sex, there's physical sex, and there's sexual attraction. And I think that we just don't have enough words yet to really properly discuss it scientifically.
Well,
and even
and-
and approach it, skeptically, because,
Right.
if you just have a little check block that said male or female, well, you're missing 17 categories.
Right.
Besides that.
Yeah, I agree with you. The other linguistic thing that's going on, or has gone on, is that transgender people morph words. They take them from the pathological people, the psychiatrists, and they reform them into something that's not pathological, but they still persist. Like transgender is one of those. It was originally a pathological term, and now you ask a transgender person if it is, and they'll say absolutely not. But we need you're right. We need another set of terms. We can't. We shouldn't rely on the pathological people to provide those terms for us. The same thing's true with gender dysphoria and also with gender identity. So I don't use, you notice I didn't use the word gender identity, although it is the word, the term most often used by researchers rather than transgender. And I've got real heartburn on using that term. Identity has a long roots back into Freud and Erickson and pathology about formation of identity, and it's clear not what people mean. And then in time for the DSM, the list of pathological terms, DSM number 3, they inserted gender identity disorder in there, and we've been laboring under trying to get rid of that for years and years.
Well, there's a strong argument to adding that one in there just to basically allow for the insurance companies to be able to pay for these medical services.
Yeah.
So we just wanted to say, well, hey, if we call it a problem, then it has to be fixed. Then insurance
Right.
companies have. I agree, though. It really befuddles it.
Right.
And one of the just kind of a side point of something that I found that from a lot of the LGBT conferences and medical conferences I've been to, that the stories that I've heard brought up by older trans women,
Yeah.
is that they decided to come out after their wife died when they were 75,
Yes.
or they
Yes.
decided to come out at 55 once the kids had grandkids and the kids were in college, or the grandkids were in college. At different stepping points, these people decided to. So I think there's going to be this huge, whatever numbers we have in statistics when we're talking about whether it's nature or nurture, and just like everything else genetic, it's just going to be a factor.
Yeah.
If you smoke, it doesn't guarantee you're going to die of cancer. It increases your chance by this
Right.
percentage. If you have these genetic factors, it increases your chances probably the same way, but the hidden statistic are going to be the people that know that, well, my dad would have taken me behind the farm and just shot me in the head if he found out.
Right.
And these are real scenarios that these people told me
Yeah,
about when they were growing up.
Yeah, it's very common for a person to lose their wife or husband and then transition or just greatly increase their cross-dressing. And there are a number of reasons why. First of all, there's a little more freedom. Secondly, they go into what psychiatrists would call existential crises. They realize, one of which is mortality. You realize, I ain't got that many years left, and so I might as well be myself. Okay, and that's part of it as well. So yeah, it's very common, and I wish there was more research on that, and more research on older trans people in general, because I am one. But I'm making myself very unpopular as being on the board of directors of USPath by trying to do that, trying to get the people who study geriatrics to help us with older transgender people. And I'm also trying to, most transgender people don't transition. And WPATH has done a splendid job of working with people who transition but they've totally ignored the non-transitioning people. Yet they claim to be responsible for transgender health. So is this upcoming meeting next week? I may get drummed out of the core, but I'm trying to make an effort to change things.
I think it's important for the medical community to get heavily involved in a lot of these definitions, and and I work in medicine as well, and I still get on my forums and I hear someone that'll say, well, because of my religion, I'm not sure how I'm supposed to treat these people. I'm not sure if I should treat the. You hear these philosophical, debates that they're going, which is, more of a reflection of an internal conflict, in my opinion. But
Right.
they bring these things up, and it's going to be really hard when you have someone thinking that, the Hippocratic Oath and the obligation to helping all people all the time is like, oh, unless they're trans, then it's okay.
Right.
And so we have a big fight to get definitions to start with.
Yep, I agree. Yes. Okay. This will be the last question.
Thank you so much for your talk. I wonder, could you share any thoughts you might have about the current state of research into elevated mental health risks for transgender youth?
For which health
Transgender
risks?
youth.
What, for health risks?
Mental health risks?
Oh, mental health risks. Okay. Transgender kids, we're now going into a phase where we are actually treating transgender kids, which we haven't done before, by and large, other than to smack them in the head when they do the wrong thing. But there are co-occurrences of other phenomena that have been observed with transgender kids. For example, being on the autism spectrum, but that's not. There's no clear relationship there, although there have been studies about that. As far as what the current work we're doing with them to arrest puberty, which you probably know about. That should be the next thing I talk about. But as far as we know so far, they're doing just fine. They're worried that what this is about is there are certain drugs that you can give to kids, or anybody, I guess, before puberty, that will arrest puberty, which will prevent it from starting. And so the current one way of treating these trans kids now is to give them that drug to avoid puberty until they can decide what gender they want to fit into. Okay, and at that point, then they may decide that they want to change their sex. So those drugs may have some side effects, particularly on things like. And they're looking very carefully at this. Things like bone density and the like. But as far as I know, there is no mental health problem. Those kids do very well. I taught some of them. They're good kids, and I wouldn't say they had mental problems at all. But there are these co-occurrences, which are mainly the main fact of it is that clinics take in the university clinics take in patients that typically have more than one thing wrong with them, in a sense, or one thing going on with them, because they're not wrong, they're just what they are. And in fact, at Harvard, the Harvard Gender Clinic, it's like 40% of the kids in there have other things going on with them, depression, what have you. But what we know about, for example, what we know about depression is that treating the kid helps that and may roll it back. So, those things that co-occur may or may not have any causative relationship. Or if they do, that it's the person's depressed because they're being picked on, bullied because they're trans. And depression is quite frequent in that kind of situation. So I hope I answered your.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you go to the meet and greet, and you can ask 1,000 questions. Yeah, all night.
You're welcome. Thank you.